Hi everyone, this is Noelle and I'm here at Casa Verde, which is our growing facility for Petitti Garden Centers. And I'm so happy to be here because it's wonderful being around all these beautiful blooming orchids and bromeliads behind me. I'm going to talk to you about orchids today because we're just going to focus on the care of some of the easiest orchids out there. They're known as moth orchids or Phalaenopsis orchids. I do have a couple others that I'll talk to you about in just a moment. The reason we like growing Phalaenopsis orchids is they are a beginner orchid. And where people do not have success with orchids is generally because they overwater them. So I want you to keep that in the back of your mind when you are caring for orchids of any kind. They do not need to be watered heavily. These are the types of plants, most of them grow up on top of trees. They're what they call an epiphytic plant. So it's an air plant. They sit on top of larger trees and they're absorbing humidity, nutrients, water right out of the air. So again, trying to keep those roots on the slightly drier side is a good idea. Okay, so let's start out with lighting. Lighting for your Phalaenopsis orchid is going to be bright indirect light. So that means no sun, folks. You really do not want direct sunlight coming through the windows and hitting their foliage. If you have a bright sunny window, what you want to do is you want to pull that plant away from the window so it's not getting direct light on it, okay? A northern exposure window is perfect for Phalaenopsis because it is all indirect light. So that's the lighting that they prefer. Again, you can use artificial lighting right around the 14-hour mark for artificial lighting. So in offices and things where you don't have windows, you can definitely use the artificial lighting to take care of this plant. The next thing that we should talk about is the watering. Again, I mentioned watering this plant, what you want to do is you want to water with room temperature or lukewarm water, and you want to run it through the soil base that is in this pot. Lots of orchids will be grown in a bark type mixture. Some will be grown in a moss type mixture. The bark mixture is always going to dry out and drain a lot faster. The moss mixture is going to hold on to the moisture. So you do have to figure out what type of soil you have, and then of course go ahead and see if that soil still has moisture in it. Normally with a 4-inch Phalaenopsis orchid in the winter, it can be watered once about every 2 to 3 weeks, believe it or not. The smaller mini Phalaenopsis orchid, I have a smaller one right here. It's in a teeny tiny like 2 to 3 inch pot. It might need watering about once every week, okay? So just be aware of that. That of course your watering is going to vary from your pot size and your soil holding capacity as well in the pot. The other thing about watering, orchids love humidity. They naturally grow in the rainforest. So spray misting them in the morning, putting them on a humidity tray, clustering them together with other foliage plants like the philodendron that like humidity is a really good idea. Try to keep that humidity around these plants. They love it. Temperatures. So this is kind of tricky. Temperatures on orchids help them go into bud and bloom phase. What they're looking for ideally is a cooler evening temperature and then about 15 to 20 degree rise in temperature during the day. I know it can be difficult in the household. At night, maybe around the 60 degree mark, and then during the day, if you get up to 70 degrees, 75 degrees, not bad, okay? And that orchid's really gonna appreciate that, and the temperature difference is really gonna help them set your buds and your blooms for later. As far as your soil is concerned, we talked about bark or moss. And when do you repot these guys? Well, if their roots are sticking out of the soil, these gray roots are air roots. And believe me, they want to be out of the soil. They do not want to be potted in this pot. So most of the time, orchids can stay in a pot 1, 2, 3 years after you have purchased them, and they'll be fine. They like to be pot bound, and if the air roots are coming out, that's not a problem whatsoever. You're gonna repot them normally in the spring when we tend to repot most of our houseplants, and go ahead and use the same potting material that you have in that pot right now. So if there's bark in the pot, repot with bark. If there's moss in the pot, repot with moss. The other thing that I was gonna tell you about the orchids is that with fertilizing, these plants do really well with a week fertilizer, meaning that if you put a water-soluble fertilizer into their water and then you're watering them weekly or once every other week, that's fine. For example, you have Miracle-Gro at the house, and you go ahead and dilute that in water, probably half to quarter strength, and then use that in your water regimen. That's gonna do really well for the orchids. You can also use an orchid fertilizer, and there's lots of varieties out there. I have Espoma's organic orchid food, okay? This one, they tend to recommend with your watering about once every 2 weeks, okay? Same thing, this is kind of a neat product. This is Miracle-Gro's orchid spray. This one you spray once a week right on the foliage of the plant. Avoid your blossoms, avoid your flowering stems, but the foliage, the soil of that pot, you can spray this right on there once a week. So that's a neat way of watering, or excuse me, fertilizing the orchids weekly at a week rate, if you will. So that works out really, really nicely. Couple things that I want to mention to you. If you are growing a Phalaenopsis orchid and these leaves are starting to become, they should be olive green naturally, but if they start to become darker, like a very dark evergreen color, it usually means they're not exposed to enough light. And the opposite effect, if you see red in the leaves, like red edges or maybe red streaks through the foliage, that usually indicates too much light. So do look at your leaves and the health of your foliage with the Phalaenopsis orchids, okay? Now, the one last thing that everybody always asks is, how do I get my Phalaenopsis orchid to rebloom? And this is one of the few that we have really, really good success with, getting it to rebloom right after its bloom cycle finishes. So I will have Taylor take some close-ups to show you, but what you're looking at on your flowering stem is you're looking at the first flower that comes into bloom. This is also going to be the first flower that will also fall off of the stem. When it falls off and when all these flowers are done blooming, and it could take months, you know, 2, 3, 4 months for Phalaenopsis orchids to finish their flower cycle. But when it is finished and go back down to where this first flower was, you'll see kind of a scar there. You are going to clip it right above that first flower scar, and there's cells there that are really, really productive. It'll make that stem branch into 2 branches with more buds on it. So that's how you keep your Phalaenopsis blooming. If for whatever reason the branch goes ahead and the stem kind of dies back, yellows out, that's okay, it'll dry out. What I want you to do is I want you to count 1, 2 leaf nodes above the foliage, and then clip right above the foliage, and then you will start to see new stems forming. It may take a few months, it may take a year. Just remember, light, temperature, and fertilizer are definitely the key for the Phalaenopsis orchids to repeat bloom for you. Be patient and always keep them on the drier side of watering, okay? You can use ice cubes too, so that's another tip. People ask if they can put ice cubes in their pot. Yeah, 4-inch pot, if you can fit about 1 to 3 ice cubes around once a week or once every other week, yeah, that'll work out just fine. We tend to prefer using that lukewarm water method, but if ice cubes are handy and that works for you, not a problem whatsoever. One other plant that I wanted to mention was the bamboo orchid, and I did want to tell you this is kind of an intermediate type orchid. This orchid's a little bit different. If you look at it, it has a stem that has like nodes like bamboo, okay? And these stems are very, very thick, so they hold a lot of water. So if you think you're gonna let these guys dry out slightly before you water them, you really want to let this one dry out really well before you water it again, because it's holding a lot of water in its stem, just like a succulent would be doing, okay? So be aware that if you're growing a dendrobium orchid, they do like to be very dry before you re-water them. They also like to be very pot bound, just like the Phalaenopsis. They do like a little bit more light. So if you can expose them to some direct sunlight, that's fine. And they tend to like a little bit warmer temperatures than the Phalaenopsis as well. So just be aware that there's a couple different, well, there's thousands of different orchids, but these are probably one of the two most common that you'll come across. They're both great air purifiers and they'll look beautiful in your home. Enjoy.